Hi and welcome back to my channel. My name's Joanne. I'm a mum of 3 children and I home educate those 3 children here in the UK. In today's video, I'm going to be continuing my review of this book by Kerry McDonald. It is called Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside of the Conventional Classroom. If you're interested in this book, then I really highly recommend picking up a copy. I got my one from Amazon. This is not one of the books that is really talked about a lot in home education circles, or at least it took me several years to come across it. I've been home educating my own 3 children for 6 years now, and books like Free to Learn by Peter Gray or Changing Our Minds by Naomi Fisher are quite well known. As soon as you enter the home educating, particularly unschooling type space, then you will come across those books. This one was not one that I'd come across. It's not as highly discussed, but the foreword is by Dr. Peter Gray, and this lady Kerry McDonald works with Dr. Peter Gray. She's got some really good thoughts on home education and on unschooling. So her second chapter is called What is Unschooling? And she begins the chapter by talking about a lady called Katie who has been raised within the school system. Both of her parents worked within the system, and then of course she grew up, went to school, and then she graduated and became a teacher herself. Then she became a bit disillusioned with the system, decided to stop teaching, and when she had her own children, although she'd always assumed that they'd go to school, they found another path and they began home educating, and they also ended up unschooling. I feel like it's so interesting when you look into it. There are so many former teachers in the unschooling, home educating space, and this is just one example of a person that wanted better for her children, really, after seeing the system from the inside out. In this chapter, Kerry talks about a definition for unschooling. Kerry says that unschooling is learning without schooling, including school at home. Unschooling rejects the schooling prototype of education and instead values a learning one that looks nothing like school. The unschooling approach of education is non-coercive, meaning that children are not required or expected to learn things the way that they are in compulsory schools or in school-like settings. And like grown-ups, unschooled children have the freedom to say no. He goes on to say that unschooling dismisses things like adult-imposed curriculum, grade levels, subject silos, age segregation, lesson plans, rewards and punishment, and arbitrary tests and rankings, and that unschooling is separating school from education. So what I've felt over the past 6 years of my journey is that it is hard to identify as an unschooler because there are certain sort of unwritten unschooling rules, and I'm not always sure that we as a family play by those rules. But I would say that broadly speaking, once you take your children out of school, if you are not directly recreating a school type environment at home, then you are probably somewhere on the unschooling spectrum. What is unschooling is a huge question, but for us in our house, it just means that the majority of the time we are allowing the children to direct their own education, I guess. And I am there obviously to support them and to introduce them to new ideas. I feel like a criticism that unschoolers often get is, well, you know, children don't know what they don't know, so how are you going to introduce them to new things if you just let them lead the way and follow their interests? I think that's underestimating the role of the home educator and of the parent in all this. Parents have a huge amount of influence over what their children are exposed to. We have huge amounts of influence over the environment that our children are in, and I don't need to assign reading for my children to just naturally be curious and pick up the books and magazines that are around our house. I don't have to force my children to go to the library when they've never had a experience of a library as a boring place, if that makes sense. Like, we have library days where we go to the library and then we go to the park, and while we're at the library, the kids of course engage with books. You know, what else are they going to do there? Like, they find topics that they enjoy, and they are introduced to things that they may not be introduced to if they were at home all the time. But unschooled kids and home educated kids aren't just at home all the time. They are out living their lives and they are around lots of different people. Obviously, we are a Muslim family, but my children come in contact with loads of different families from lots of different backgrounds, whether they are families from a different religious tradition or no religious tradition, families that have a different setup to us in terms of parents. I read aloud a lot to my children, and I read aloud a lot of books that they choose themselves, but I always make sure that I have a book that I've chosen and that I'm reading to them too. And I don't see that as coercive. As long as they are happy for me to read that book to them, which they usually are, then I can introduce my children to a wealth of ideas simply through that one read aloud time per day. This week, for instance, we've been learning about the Irish famine. Now, that's not something that I had learned about growing up, but it was something I heard about and I wanted to learn more about. And so myself and my children are reading through the Children of the Famine series, I believe it's called. We just read the first book of the series, Under the Hawthorn Tree, and my kids are really into it now. When we finished that book last night, they asked me to go and get the next book off on Amazon. They asked if I would order that today so that it comes as quick as possible because they're really enjoying the topic. And there's so many other different ways that you can introduce different topics to your children. I know that my eldest son, for example, has an interest in physics. And so I bought him an Usborne Beginner's Guide to Physics book. And I didn't even tell him that I bought the book, actually. I just put it near where he usually eats his snacks. And almost every time I've seen him eating lately, he's been picking up that book and leafing through it. That, again, is non-coercive education, but it is education nonetheless. He's reading the same book as he would be if I, told him, I need you to read this book. I'm going to assign it to you, read this amount of pages per day. He may be reading it at a slightly different pace, but that pace may be even faster. And the difference, I think, and Kerry points this out in her book, is that actually concepts are retained better when a child's interest has initiated the learning. When we just make a curriculum and we say, okay, the curriculum's telling us to teach physics at this point, at this age, at this time, in this way, actually how much of that is retained? Because I learnt physics at school. I must have done because I passed my GCSE in double science, and yet I hardly remember any of it. In fact, I hardly remember any of the content for any of my GCSEs, and I didn't do too badly in them either. And so I think this is the difference maybe between being schooled and being truly educated. Kerry actually dedicates a part of this chapter to curriculum, to discussing the history of curriculum, the beliefs that we hold around children having gaps in their knowledge if they don't follow a curriculum. And she talks about how curriculum can be a resource that we bring into our homes, but that the difference is that we're not using it in a coercive way, or that our children see it basically as one of several different options. And I think that's a really delightful way of looking at things. She next up talks about another lady called Deanna, who had also been a school teacher and also ended up home educating her children. Apparently she has a blog, Adventures in Teaching My Own, which I haven't checked out, but that sounds really good. And she talks about this idea of trusting children. So the idea here, and this is the idea that unschooling rests on really, is that intrinsic motivation is going to be better than extrinsic motivation. So we all know that school uses things like reward, punishment, stickers, star charts, detentions, etc. to motivate children into behaving a certain way and into even sort of answering questions in a certain way, right? That there's a right answer and a wrong answer typically within a school system. Children aren't really taught to use their critical thinking skills, especially not early on. So this section called Trusting Children talks about how when you've gone through that schooly minded education system, and when you live in a school-minded society anyway, it can be really hard to trust your children and to trust their learning urges. But I have to say, after observing my children, like I say, we've lived without school now for 6 years, I can really confidently say that they sort of hit all those school subjects just independently through their own interests. I've had children interested in algebra, in diameter, in multiplication, in fractions. Sorry, I'm thinking of a lot of maths concepts because my eldest is really into maths at the moment. My children have learnt to code. They are really fantastic at art, which is not something, it's not a strength of mine. They have learnt to read really well. Like my eldest learnt in school, although I'm very convinced that he was ready to learn at the time he started school because he learnt within like a 6-week period. My younger child is learning to read, and my middle son learnt through reading eggs when he was about 4 as well. And I don't know, they've just slowly, naturally, organically progressed from those early words of, like sounding out the CVC words to being able to read things like Chronicles of Narnia. And I've watched that develop quite organically. It's not like I've made them progress through a certain set of readers or, okay, you've finished this level book, now you need to move on to that level book. They just seem to do it. And so I think it's one of those things, you can't have the experience of trusting your children until you decide to trust your children. But if you are in that in-between stage where you've maybe pulled your children out from school or you've decided to home educate and you're not sure what way to go yet, I really think a deschooling period is very valuable in that it just allows you that time and space to step back. And you're not saying you're going to unschool or, you're not committing to any specific philosophy at the time. But you can step back and you can just observe your children and see what happens when I sort of let go of the reins. What are their interests? What sort of things will they do if they're allowed to fill their day with their own pursuits? And so we come to the end of the chapter and Kerry gives us some unschooling tips. The first one is to understand regulations. Now, she is talking about America because that's where she's based. I live in what would be considered a tougher area for home educators. Our local authority really do like quite a bit of detail about what we are doing, and they like to have quite a lot of oversight. But I still feel like no matter what educational philosophy you employ, you can translate that into school speak. Because like I say, unschooling is not uneducating your children. Your children are still getting a really good, high quality education. But you may need to, when you're doing reports and things, be aware that your local council and the people working within it aren't necessarily going to be aware of all the different educational philosophies or way that children learn. I think it would be helpful if they did, but at this current time they don't. They are not necessarily qualified. I don't believe that any of our local staff are qualified in teaching or in child development or anything like that. And so it can be really handy even if you are a full unschooler to make sure when you're writing your report that you are translating what you're doing into school speak, for example. Kerry talks about creating structure. That's her next tip. And I think that, again, this is a great point. People seem to think that unschooling is just letting your kids run wild. There's no structure to the day. However, if you think back to those preschool years, you likely had a structure, even if it wasn't one based on school. And so, yes, that brings us on to Kerry's final tip, which is to facilitate learning. I think the role of an unschooling or home educating parent can really often be misunderstood. It is not just sitting back and letting your children get on with whatever. You have a really active role in home education. Even when you unschool, you are there facilitating your children's learning. You are, like I say, bringing in new experiences, maybe taking them to new places. Maybe that's bringing in books or projects or resources into your house and at least exposing your children to those ideas. A lot of parents like to strew materials. You might want to have an art room or a place where your children can code or, depends really on your children and what they enjoy doing, but you won't know if they enjoy doing something until you expose them to it. And like I say, cultivating a rich learning environment is one of Kerry's tips in here, and that is probably one of the easiest ways to facilitate learning in your home. If your children have an interest in something, or obviously children have social needs, you are the one facilitating that, connecting them to their wider community through local home education groups or extracurricular activities that you think they may enjoy. Just because we are allowing our children to say no to certain things doesn't mean that we don't give them the option of these things. And I mean, a rule in our house has been actually that we take our children to these experiences first, and then if they don't enjoy them, they are allowed to say no to going to that particular group again in the future. And obviously we have 3 children, and so that has to be a vote between the children. If one person really wants to attend something and the other 2 aren't feeling it, then we'll often attend, and I'll just try and keep the other 2 happy by maybe allowing them to bring along another activity that they can sit on the sidelines and do. But I think it is important, like again, this comes back to the children don't know what they don't know thing. It's really important that children do try out new experiences at least. But then once they've tried it out and they know, hey, I'm not a fan of ballet or gymnastics or art group or whatever it is, then I think it's perfectly fine for them to say, actually, no, I don't want to return. And I think it's then perfectly reasonable for us as parents to respect that. Anyway, I'm looking forward to continuing through this book. I had already read up to chapter 6, 7 by the looks of it, but I am going back and rereading the chapters in order to make these videos, and I'm still getting a lot out of it. Like I say, I highly recommend this book if you haven't picked it up already. And until next time, I will see you then. Take care. Bye.